My father sold my grandmother's car to his girlfriend's son after promising it to my brother. So I exposed him in front of our entire extended family at Christmas dinner. And what happened next destroyed his relationship with everyone he claimed to love. There are moments in life when someone you thought you knew reveals their true character in the most devastating way possible. When they break a promise so sacred, so meaningful, that it changes everything you believed about them forever. When family loyalty crumbles under the weight of selfishness and betrayal. This moment was mine. I'm Zara, I'm 26 years old, and this is the story of how one broken promise led me to take down the man who was supposed to protect us. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because understanding my father requires understanding our history. Growing up in suburban Phoenix, my dad wasn't just absent, he was destructive. For years, he terrorized our household with his volatile temper and controlling behavior. My mom, Delilah, endured it for the sake of keeping our family together, but by the time I turned 18, she'd finally had enough. The divorce 8 years ago wasn't just a legal separation, it was our family's declaration of independence from a man who'd caused us nothing but pain. My two brothers, Kieran who's 24 and Flynn who's 22, and I finally had the chance to heal from years of walking on eggshells around our father's unpredictable rage. But there was one bright spot in Dad's side of the family, my grandmother, who we all called Oma. She was everything my father wasn't. Where he was selfish, she was generous. Where he was cruel, she was kind. Oma had this incredible way of making each of us feel special, like we were her favorite grandchild. She'd slip us $20 bills when Dad wasn't looking and whisper, "Don't tell your father, but you're my little star." Her house always smelled like fresh-baked cookies and lavender, and her quirky decorating style made her place feel like a wonderland compared to the tension that constantly filled our own home. The irony wasn't lost on any of us that this gentle, loving woman had somehow raised a son who became her complete opposite. Oma would shake her head sadly whenever Dad's name came up in conversation, saying things like, "I don't know where I went wrong with that boy. He has everything he could want, but he's never satisfied." She'd been our refuge during the worst years of our childhood, the one person who could calm Dad's storms and remind him that his children deserved better than his anger. When Oma passed away last month at 87, it felt like losing the one person in Dad's family who truly understood what love meant. Her death hit us hard, but what made it even more complicated was that I'd been maintaining complete silence with my father for 2 full years before her passing. The final straw had been when he refused to help Kieran with medical expenses after a work accident, despite posting photos of his $300,000 Porsche and European ski trips on social media. But when Oma died, I knew I had to put aside my anger to say goodbye properly. The phone call that started everything came from Dad himself. His voice cracked when he heard mine, and he said, "Zara, honey, I'm so glad you picked up. I wasn't sure if you'd want to be involved, but I really need my family right now." For a moment, I heard vulnerability instead of his usual arrogance. I told him I'd help with whatever he needed for the funeral arrangements, and we actually had a civil conversation about Oma's wishes and the service details. It felt strange, but hopeful. When I arrived at the funeral home for the viewing, something unexpected happened. Vivian, my father's girlfriend of 6 years, the same woman he'd been having an affair with before my parents' divorce, approached me with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Zara, it's so good to see you," she said, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "Your father has missed you so much. I know this is a difficult time, but I'm glad you're here for him." Her words caught me off guard. I'd spent years viewing her as the enemy, the homewrecker who'd helped destroy our family, but in that moment, she seemed sincere. I responded carefully, "Thank you, Vivian. I appreciate that he has someone supporting him through this." I wasn't ready to forgive or forget, but I could acknowledge that grief had a way of bringing people together. The funeral service was beautiful, and for the first time in years, our fractured family sat together in the same row. Dad seemed genuinely grateful for our presence, and I began to wonder if maybe Oma's death might serve as a bridge to healing some of our old wounds. After the burial, as we gathered back at Oma's house to begin sorting through her belongings, Dad made an announcement that surprised everyone. "Look, I know Oma didn't leave a will, and honestly, her taste was pretty unique," he said with a small smile, gesturing at the eclectic mix of furniture and decorations surrounding us. "I think the best approach is for each of you to walk through and pick out things that remind you of her. Take whatever speaks to you." It was a thoughtful gesture that showed a side of him I rarely saw. That's when Kieran noticed Oma's 2015 Honda Civic parked in the driveway. It wasn't flashy, but it was reliable and fuel-efficient, exactly what he needed. He'd been struggling financially ever since his work injury, surviving on disability payments that barely covered his basic expenses, and taking the bus everywhere because he couldn't afford a car. When Dad noticed Kieran looking at the vehicle, he walked over and said something that would later become the source of our family's complete destruction. "You know what, Kieran? You should take Oma's car. She always worried about you getting around safely, and I think she'd want you to have it." My brother's face lit up with a mixture of gratitude and relief. "Are you serious, Dad? I mean, that would change everything for me. I could actually look for better job opportunities if I had reliable transportation." Dad nodded firmly and said, "Consider it done. It's yours, son." I watched this exchange with genuine warmth in my chest. Maybe Dad was finally starting to step up as a father. Maybe Oma's death had reminded him what family actually meant. Kieran spent the next hour talking excitedly about how the car would open up new possibilities for him. He could apply for jobs outside his immediate neighborhood, visit friends without relying on public transportation, and finally have some independence. Flynn and I were genuinely happy for him. After years of struggling, our brother deserved something good. The following weeks brought an unexpected sense of peace to our family dynamic. Dad called more frequently, asking how my graduate studies were going and checking in on Flynn's job at the local hardware store. He even invited us for dinner at his upscale downtown apartment, something that hadn't happened in years. During that dinner, as we sat around his granite kitchen island eating takeout from an expensive Italian restaurant, Dad seemed almost humble. He asked about our lives with genuine interest and shared stories about Oma that made us all laugh. "I know we've had our differences," Dad said as the evening wound down, "but I want you to know that you're always welcome here. Life's too short to hold grudges, and losing Mom made me realize how precious family really is." Flynn nodded appreciatively, and even I found myself thinking that maybe we could build something new from the ashes of our broken relationship. Kieran seemed especially hopeful, frequently mentioning how grateful he was for the car and how it was going to transform his prospects. But our fragile peace was shattered exactly 3 weeks after Oma's funeral. I was in my apartment, buried in research for my thesis, when my phone rang. It was my mother, and something in her voice immediately put me on alert. "Zara, honey, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it," she said carefully. My stomach dropped. "What happened, Mom?" "Flynn just called me, and he's upset. Apparently, your father sold Oma's car." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What do you mean he sold it?" "He promised it to Kieran." Mom's voice was tight with controlled anger. "I know, sweetheart. That's exactly what Flynn said. Kieran found out this morning when he went to pick up the title paperwork, and your father told him the car was already gone." I felt rage building in my chest, hot and consuming. "Who did he sell it to?" I managed to ask through gritted teeth. Mom's answer made everything 10 times worse. "Vivian's son, Marcus. Apparently, he needed a car for college, and your father just handed it over to him." Marcus. Vivian's 20-year-old son who I'd met exactly twice in 6 years. A kid who'd never even met Oma, who hadn't bothered to attend her funeral, who had absolutely no connection to our family or our grandmother's memory. My father had taken a promise made to his own son, his flesh and blood who was struggling to survive, and handed it over to his girlfriend's child like it meant nothing. "Where's Kieran now?" I asked, my voice shaking with fury. "He's at Flynn's place. Your brother said he's barely spoken since he found out. He just keeps saying he should have known better than to trust your father." The image of my brother's devastated face flashed through my mind, and I felt something cold and determined settle in my chest. I hung up the phone and immediately called Flynn. "Is Kieran okay?" I asked without preamble. Flynn's voice was tight with anger. "No, Zara, he's not okay. He's been sitting on my couch for 3 hours staring at the wall. He was supposed to start a new job next week, but without the car, he can't get there. He's talking about having to turn it down." The betrayal was complete. Not only had Dad broken his promise, but his actions were directly impacting Kieran's ability to improve his life. This wasn't just about a car anymore, it was about a pattern of behavior that showed exactly where we ranked in his priorities. Below Vivian. Below her son. Below everyone except himself. I made a decision in that moment that would change everything. "Flynn, when is Dad's Christmas party?" Every year, Dad hosted an elaborate Christmas gathering at his apartment for all his friends, Vivian's family, and whatever extended family members were still speaking to him. It was his annual opportunity to show off his success and play the role of the perfect host. December 23rd, "Why?" Flynn asked, though I could hear in his voice that he was starting to understand where my thoughts were heading. "Because that's when we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man he really is." The plan I developed over the next few weeks was simple but devastating. I would attend Dad's Christmas party with both my brothers, act completely normal throughout the evening, and then, when he inevitably made his annual toast about family and gratitude, I would stand up and tell everyone exactly what he'd done to Kieran. I would expose his broken promise, his favoritism toward Vivian's family, and his complete disregard for his own children in front of every person he wanted to impress. But first, I needed to give him one chance to make things right. The day before the party, I called him directly. "Dad, we need to talk about Kieran's car," I said without any pleasantries. There was a long pause before he responded, and when he did, his voice had that defensive edge I remembered from childhood. "Zara, look, I know you're upset, but the situation changed. Marcus needed reliable transportation for school, and it made more sense financially." "Made sense financially? Dad, you drive a Porsche worth more than most people's houses. You couldn't buy Marcus his own car?" My voice was rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "That's not the point," he snapped. "The car was mine to do with as I pleased. I don't owe any of you an explanation for my decisions." And there it was. The real truth. Not that he'd been manipulated or pressured, but that he simply didn't think his promise to Kieran mattered. "So you're telling me that you deliberately broke your word to your own son, who's struggling financially, to give a car to someone who isn't even related to us?" "Marcus is going to be my stepson soon," Dad said coldly. "Vivian and I are getting engaged next month. He's family now, whether you like it or not." The revelation hit me like a slap. Not only had he betrayed Kieran, but he was planning to officially replace us with Vivian's family. "And when exactly were you planning to tell your actual children about this engagement?" "We were going to announce it at Christmas," he said, his voice taking on that manipulative tone I knew so well. "But since you're being so dramatic about everything, maybe we should reconsider including you in our celebration." That was it. The last thread of hope I'd been holding on to snapped completely. "Don't worry, Dad. We'll be there for your announcement. Wouldn't miss it for the world." December 23rd arrived with a blanket of fresh snow covering Phoenix, which seemed fitting for what was about to be the coldest night of my father's life. Flynn, Kieran, and I arrived at Dad's apartment together, each of us dressed nicely and carrying carefully chosen gifts. To anyone watching, we looked like a happy family coming to celebrate the holidays. Dad's apartment was decorated lavishly for the occasion. Twinkling lights draped every surface, an enormous Christmas tree dominated the living room, and elegant catering stations offered expensive appetizers and premium wine. About 30 people milled around the space: Vivian's extended family, Dad's coworkers, a few neighbors, and some family friends who hadn't yet figured out what kind of person he really was. "There are my kids," Dad announced loudly when he saw us enter, his voice carrying that false cheer he used when he wanted to impress others. He approached with open arms, and I allowed him to hug me while mentally preparing for what was coming. Vivian appeared at his side, beaming and showing off what was obviously a new engagement ring. "We're so excited you could make it," she gushed, completely oblivious to the storm that was brewing. "This is going to be such a special night. We have some wonderful news to share with everyone." I smiled sweetly and said, "We're excited to hear it. Kieran especially has been looking forward to tonight." My brother shot me a questioning look, but I'd briefed him and Flynn on exactly what was going to happen. They were both on board, tired of being treated like second-class family members. The evening progressed exactly as I'd expected. Dad held court in his living room, regaling anyone who would listen with stories about his latest business successes and travel adventures. Vivian floated between guests, playing the perfect hostess and dropping hints about their big announcement. Marcus was there too, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was probably more expensive than Kieran's entire wardrobe, and completely unaware that he was driving around in a car that had been stolen from my brother's future. Around 9 o'clock, Dad called for everyone's attention. He stood in the center of the room holding a glass of champagne, with Vivian beaming beside him. "Friends, family, thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Christmas with us. This has been an incredible year, full of blessings and new beginnings." He paused dramatically, and I felt my heart rate increase. This was it. "Vivian and I have some exciting news to share. We're engaged." The room erupted in applause and congratulations, and I watched as people who barely knew them rushed forward to offer their best wishes. "But that's not all," Dad continued, clearly enjoying being the center of attention. "I want to take a moment to talk about what really matters: family. This year, we lost my mother, but her passing reminded me of the importance of holding our loved ones close. Life is precious, and the people we choose to surround ourselves with define who we are. The irony of his words was almost too much to bear. I glanced at Kieran, who was staring at the floor with his jaw clenched. Flynn caught my eye and nodded slightly. It was time. I'm blessed to have found a woman who understands the value of family, Dad was saying, his arm around Vivian's waist. And I'm grateful that my children have welcomed her and Marcus into our family with open hearts. That was my cue. I stood up slowly, and the movement caught several people's attention. Dad noticed and smiled, probably thinking I was going to offer some heartfelt words of support. Instead, I raised my own glass and said in a clear, carrying voice, I'd like to add something to what my father just said about family and the people who matter most to us. The room quieted, and all eyes turned to me. Dad's smile faltered slightly, but he couldn't stop me without causing a scene. You're absolutely right, Dad, that the people we choose to surround ourselves with define who we are. And the way we treat our family reveals our true character. I could see confusion starting to creep across some faces, and Vivian was looking between Dad and me with growing concern. 3 weeks ago, my father made a promise to my brother Kieran. He promised him our grandmother's car, a woman who raised him, who loved him unconditionally, and who worried constantly about his well-being. Dad's face had gone completely white. Zara, what are you doing? He said quietly, but his voice carried in the silent room. I'm telling everyone about the kind of man you really are, I replied, my voice steady and strong. Kieran needed that car. He's been struggling financially since a work injury, surviving on disability payments, taking the bus everywhere because he couldn't afford transportation. When you promised him Oma's car, it wasn't just a gift, it was hope. Hope that he could find better work, hope that he could rebuild his life, hope that his father finally cared about his welfare. The room was completely silent now. I could see Marcus shifting uncomfortably near the back, and several of Dad's coworkers were exchanging glances. But last week, Kieran discovered that his father had sold that car. Sold the car he'd been promised to Marcus, who never even met our grandmother, who didn't attend her funeral, who has no connection to her memory or our family. Zara, stop this right now, Dad said, his voice taking on that threatening tone I remembered from childhood. But he couldn't intimidate me anymore, not in front of all these people. The best part is why he did it, I continued, my voice growing stronger. Not because he needed the money. This is a man who owns a $300,000 sports car and takes international ski vacations. Not because he was confused or manipulated, but because he cares more about impressing his new family than keeping promises to the children he raised. Vivian looked like she was going to be sick. Several guests were starting to murmur among themselves, and I could see some people moving toward the door. Dad's carefully constructed image was crumbling in real time. So when my father talks about family and the people who matter most, remember this story. Remember that he chose to break his word to his struggling son in order to give a free car to his girlfriend's child. Remember that he values his new relationship more than the children who survived years of his abuse and still showed up to support him when his mother died. I set down my glass and looked directly at Dad, whose face was now a mixture of rage and humiliation. That's the kind of man you're celebrating tonight. That's the kind of family you're marrying into, Vivian. I hope Marcus enjoys the car. I hope it was worth destroying what little relationship you had left with your actual children. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, people started moving. Some headed for the door without saying anything. Others approached Kieran and Flynn to offer quiet words of support. Dad's carefully planned evening was disintegrating before his eyes. How dare you, he finally managed to say, his voice shaking with fury. How dare you come into my home and humiliate me like this? I learned from the best, I replied calmly. You've been humiliating your family for years. Tonight, I just made sure everyone else could see it too. Vivian finally found her voice. Zara, I had no idea about any of this. If I'd known, you would have what? I interrupted. Convinced him to keep his promise? Made sure your son didn't accept a car that belonged to someone else? The time for damage control is over, Vivian. You're marrying a man who will throw away his own children the moment it becomes convenient. With that, I turned to my brothers. Come on, guys. We're done here. Kieran and Flynn followed me toward the door, and I could hear the conversation starting behind us as Dad tried desperately to explain himself to his remaining guests. As we waited for the elevator, Flynn turned to me with something like awe in his voice. Zara, that was incredible. Did you see his face when you started talking about the car? Kieran was quiet, but when I looked at him, he was standing straighter than I'd seen him in weeks. He needed to know that his actions have consequences, I said. And everyone in that room needed to see who he really is. The aftermath was swift and devastating for Dad. Within a week, 3 of his coworkers had mentioned the incident to him, expressing their discomfort with what they'd witnessed. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd been friendly for years, stopped acknowledging him in the hallway. Most telling of all, Vivian's sister called off the New Year's Eve party she'd been planning, citing family complications. But the real fallout came from Vivian herself. According to Flynn, who heard it from our cousin Rachel, Vivian had confronted Dad about the car situation the day after Christmas. When she learned that not only was the story true, but that Dad had deliberately misled her about his relationship with his children, she demanded he make things right. When he refused, claiming he'd done nothing wrong, she gave him an ultimatum: buy Karen a replacement car and apologize publicly, or their engagement was over. Dad chose his pride over his relationship. By New Year's Day, Vivian had moved out of his apartment and returned her engagement ring. Marcus, apparently mortified by the whole situation, tried to return the Honda to Karen, but my brother refused to take it. "I don't want anything that comes from him anymore," Karen told Flynn. "I'd rather take the bus for the rest of my life than drive a car that reminds me of his broken promises." The car situation resolved itself in an unexpected way. Vivian, feeling genuinely terrible about her role in the whole mess, convinced Marcus to sell the Honda and give the money directly to Karen. It was enough for him to make a down payment on a different used car, one that came with no emotional baggage attached. More importantly, the job he'd almost lost due to transportation issues worked with him to adjust his start date, and he began working there in January. As for Dad, the man who'd hosted elaborate parties and surrounded himself with admirers found himself increasingly isolated. His attempts to reach out to us were met with silence. His social circle, having witnessed his character firsthand, began excluding him from gatherings. Even his relationship with his own siblings became strained when word of the incident reached them. The final blow came in March, when Dad showed up unannounced at my apartment. He looked older, tired, and for the first time since I'd known him, genuinely defeated. "Zara, please," he said when I opened the door. "We need to talk. I've lost everything. Vivian's gone, my friends won't return my calls, and I haven't spoken to my children in months. I don't know how to fix this." I looked at this man who had terrorized my childhood, who had broken his promise to my struggling brother, who had chosen his own comfort over his children's well-being at every opportunity, and I felt something I'd never felt before: pity. "Dad," I said quietly, "you didn't lose everything. You threw it away. You had a chance to be a real father to us after Oma died, and instead, you proved that we'll never be your priority. You had a chance to keep your word to Karen, and instead, you chose to impress people who barely know you. You had a chance to build something real with Vivian, and instead, you showed her exactly what kind of man she was marrying." "I know I made mistakes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm your father. Doesn't that count for something?" "Being a father isn't about biology," I replied. "It's about being there when your children need you. It's about keeping your promises. It's about putting their well-being above your own ego. You've never done any of those things." I paused, choosing my words carefully for what I knew would be our final conversation. "The saddest part is that we gave you so many chances. Even after years of abuse, we came to Oma's funeral. We tried to rebuild our relationship. We were willing to forgive everything if you could just prove that we mattered to you. But instead, you proved the opposite." Dad stood there for a long moment, and I could see the realization dawning on his face that there was no coming back from this. No grand gesture that would fix what he'd broken. No manipulation that would work anymore. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked, and for the first time in my life, I heard genuine desperation in his voice. "Learn from this," I said. "Become the kind of person Oma thought you could be. But do it for yourself, not for us. Because we're done giving you chances to hurt us." I closed the door gently, and I haven't seen or spoken to him since. Flynn tells me he still calls occasionally, leaving voicemails that no one returns. Karen has changed his phone number entirely. Mom says he looks lost whenever she sees him around town, like a man who finally understands the cost of his choices but learned it too late to matter. As for us, we're thriving. Kieran got promoted at his new job and is saving money to go back to school. Flynn started dating a wonderful woman who adores our chaotic family dinners. I finished my graduate program and accepted a research position that I love. We spend holidays together now, real holidays, filled with laughter and genuine affection, not the tense performances we endured for years. Sometimes people ask me if I regret what I did at that Christmas party. They wonder if I should have handled it differently, been more forgiving, given him another chance. But I've learned something important about toxic family members. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop enabling their behavior. Sometimes protecting yourself and the people you care about requires drawing a line that can't be uncrossed. My father made his choice when he decided that keeping a promise to his struggling son was less important than impressing his girlfriend's family. I made my choice when I decided that my brother's dignity was worth more than my father's reputation. I chose my real family, the people who show up, who keep their promises, who put love above convenience. And I've never been happier to be free.